But it is really good to be here tonight. I hope that you can understand me, whether you're hearing me in English, or well done to our translators who will do their best to translate into Finnish. And hopefully there'll be no misunderstandings. Recently I was reading our local newspaper back in Bournemouth, and it was reporting how the main road into our town was being closed. And it said, I think they were talking about the fact they were having to cut down some trees. But obviously the copy editor hadn't done their job, because it said the road is closed because we're clearing away the vegetarians. I think they meant vegetation. Anyway, hopefully no misunderstanding tonight. And as we said, there's time for questions at the end. Please feel free to write your questions down. If there are no questions at the end, I'll just assume that you all agree with everything I say. Okay? So if you don't, please feel free to tell us why. And tonight's big question is this: is God just an illusion? We've had an illusionist tonight doing some tricks. But you may also have heard of this illusionist from the UK, Derren Brown. Derren Brown actually grew up in a Christian family. And he would have called himself a Christian for much of his life, up until his time as a student. But today, he certainly wouldn't. He would describe himself as an atheist. And he reflected on his upbringing, and he said, I just believed because I had always done so, and because it had become a very important psychological trick. So he sees that actually his belief in God as a child was really just a kind of illusion, a kind of psychological trick. And that idea that belief in God is a kind of psychological trick or crutch is one that's been around for a number of years. Perhaps the first person to really popularize that idea was Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud talked about it in this way. He said, religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillment of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. Thus, the benevolent rule of the divine providence allays our fears of the dangers of life. In other words, what Freud was saying is that our belief in God is just wish fulfillment. We believe in God because we want there to be a God, because the idea of God is comforting and it makes us feel better, and certainly it makes us feel better in the face of death. It's just an illusion. And that idea certainly comes through in this film. Has anyone seen the film, The Invention of Lying? Anyone seen the film? Okay, no one has seen the film. Okay, it's kind of all right. You can decide whether to watch it. But it's basically directed by a guy called Ricky Gervais. He also is the main actor. And he's also very well known for being a very outspoken atheist. And in the film, he plays a character who lives in a world where nobody can lie. Everybody has to tell the truth. And this is very convenient, he discovers, because you can tell the bank manager that you have lots of money in your bank account and he will give it to you, even when you don't. Or you can tell a beautiful woman that you are, in fact, very, very handsome when you're not, and she, some for reason, will believe you. But also he finds there are other reasons to lie as well. His mother lies dying in hospital, and she expresses her great fear at the prospect that when she dies, she'll go to an eternal nothingness, that this is very much the end of everything. And Ricky's character, Mark, looks at his mother and says, but you won't. You'll go to a wonderful place where there'll be no more pain and suffering, and all your friends and family will be there, and you'll live happily there forever. And she dies with a smile on her face. And suddenly this belief spreads across the world because everyone likes it. But of course the point of the film is this: it's just a lie. It's just an illusion. It's not really true. And maybe that's what some of you think tonight. The only reason why people believe in God is because they want it to be true. Now, of course, in one sense, that could be the case, right? That could be a very good argument. But also, you could turn it round the other way. You could say, you know, the reason why some people don't believe in God is because they don't want it to be true. The argument cuts both ways. In fact, some people are honest enough to admit that. Thomas Nagel is professor of philosophy at New York University. And he said this in his book recently. He said, "I want atheism to be true. And I'm made uneasy by the fact some of the most intelligent people I know are religious believers. It isn't just I don't believe in God and naturally hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want a universe like that." So here's the thing. Some people might believe in God because they want God to exist. Some people might not believe in God because they don't want God to exist. But actually, it doesn't help us with the question, does God exist? For that question, we'd actually have to look at the evidence, wouldn't we? So that's what I want us to do, just briefly tonight before we break and then go to questions. What is the evidence for the existence of God? Is he just an illusion, or does he really exist? Now, I want to say right up that I cannot prove that God exists to you tonight. Now, that's not because I don't believe it's true, but that's just because actually, technically speaking, proof is rarely found in any discipline in life. In fact, outside of pure mathematics, it's very difficult to talk about proof, even in the natural sciences. So we're not talking about a knockdown proof, but actually what we do want to look at is evidence and ask ourselves the question, what is the best explanation of the evidence available? So let me give you 4 pieces of evidence tonight, and you can decide for yourself what you think is the best explanation, okay? The first 3 you might say are clues to the existence of God. The 4th one you might say is more conclusive, if you want to have a pun on the word. But let's have a look and see where we go. Here's the first clue or piece of evidence, and that is the beginning of the universe. The beginning of the universe. If you had spoken to this guy, Bertrand Russell, a philosopher of about 100 years ago, and asked Bertrand Russell, how did the universe come into existence? He would have probably looked at you and said, that's a really silly question. The universe didn't come into existence. The universe has always been here. And he would have been reflecting the common assumption of people of his generation. If you ask most people today the same question, they wouldn't respond like Bertrand Russell, because actually the common assumption today is that the universe hasn't always been here, that there was a point when it came into existence. And the reason for that is partly due to this guy, Georges Lemaitre. Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian cosmologist and also a Catholic priest. And he was the first person who theorized about what we now popularly call the Big Bang. And he came to the conclusion that this universe, because it is expanding, had a point when it came into existence in space and time, and that everything, space and time and matter, owes its existence to that one point in time. Now, a lot of people say to me, as a Christian, how do you explain the Big Bang? But actually, when this was first put forwards, the people who objected to it the most were not Christians, but atheists. Because if the universe came into existence, the natural question to ask is what caused it to come into existence? And that cause must be outside of space and time and matter. And just a few years ago, Stephen Hawking, the great physicist, said, people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks or points towards a divine intervention. And so begs the question for us, how did the universe come into existence? Well, if the Christian story is true, that's not a great problem, is it? Because it speaks of a God who is outside of space and time and matter, who is not a contingent being who brought the universe into existence. But if there is no God, how do we answer that question? Well, Stephen Hawking himself caused headline news back in the UK just a few years ago by coming to an explanation that he felt explained that question. He said in his latest and final book before he died, it is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper, the fuse, to set the universe going. Because there's a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now, I believe Stephen Hawking is one of the greatest physicists of all time. But I'm not sure that was the greatest statement he ever made. Because there are at least 2 problems, I think, with that. The first problem is this. A law doesn't create anything, does it, on its own? The law of mathematics cannot create me a fortune. It can only explain why I don't have a fortune. Laws don't create, they only explain. And secondly, where did the law of gravity come from in the first place? For that isn't nothing, is it? I'm not sure it answers the question. So the first clue or piece of evidence is the beginning of the universe. But what about the second one, the fine-tuning of the universe? Anyone remember the story from childhood of Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Yeah? Is this kind of popular in Finland as well? Yeah, you've heard of it. And you know how Goldilocks goes into the woods and she finds the house of the three bears and she goes into the room and she sits in the big chair, the little chair, the medium chair, and eats the hot porridge, the cold porridge, and so on. And in each occasion, it's baby bear's porridge or chair or bed that's just right. It's not too big, too small, too hard, too soft, too hot, too cold. It's just right. And actually, physicists talk about our universe as having the Goldilocks principle. In other words, that the laws of physics in our universe are just right to sustain life and to make life possible on a place like planet Earth. And what they've discovered is that the chances of them being just right are very, very small. That the initial constants of the laws of physics in those nanoseconds after the Big Bang had to be right to such a small degree that the chances are almost impossible. Let me illustrate just one of them. Don't worry if you don't understand the physics, it will illustrate the point though. One of those constants was the initial entropy of the universe. And this had to be just right to this fine degree. 1 in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123, which most of us can guess is quite a big number, right? Even if you're not a mathematician. Now, how big is that number? Well, let's imagine you were to write that number out in full, trying to write every single zero after the 1, okay? Well, actually, that would be quite a hard thing to do. Do you know why? Because in our known universe, there are only 10 to the power 80 atoms. So you wouldn't actually be able to do it. So what we're talking about is infinitesimally small probabilities when it comes to the fine-tuning of our universe. And the question is, why is our universe that way? And many physicists say it seems like someone or something set it up to be that way. Now, of course, if you believe in God, that's not particularly a problem, because not only is God outside of space and time, but if he were to create a universe like this, he could create a universe in a very specific and deliberate way. But what if there isn't? How would we explain it? Well, some people would say, well, it's just chance. That's, chance, sometimes unlikely things happen, like winning the lottery. But hey, I give you a suggestion. Imagine this. Imagine this week you win the lottery, the jackpot, the full millions. Great. But imagine next week you win it again. And the week after you win it again and again and again. And actually you win it every single week for the next 10 years. Do you think anyone is going to say, it's just chance? These kind of things happen. I don't think so. I think someone's going to be saying, hang on a minute, there's something sus going on here. In fact, I was giving this talk in Serbia and everyone started laughing. And I was like, what are you laughing about? And they told me about what happened just a week before in the Serbian lottery. And that was the numbers came up on the screen before they actually came out of the machine. And everyone realized that something sus was indeed going on. You see, when we're talking about coincidences of that kind of, probability, we kind of assume that maybe there is an intelligence behind it. Another explanation, which you may have come across if you have talked about this in any detail, is the idea that we are not just in one universe, but there are actually millions or multitudes of universes, the multiverse idea. And we happen to live in the one that just got it right. problem with that, of course, is it's not actually a scientific explanation because science deals with the observable, and by very nature of the idea, other universes beyond our own aren't observable or investigable. It's an assumption, which is quite convenient if you want to get rid of the alternative, that it might be God, but it's certainly not scientific. But what about a third clue or piece of evidence? We've had the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe. Thirdly, moral values, our sense of right and wrong. I come from a family of 6. I am not married and have no children, but my 5 siblings are all married, and I now have 14 nieces and nephews as of last week. So you can imagine that Christmas is a very expensive time of year, okay? And it's also a very difficult time of year because you have to try and be fair. You have to try and spend the right amount of money on all your nieces and nephews. And of course, it's, in my opinion, easier to buy for the boys because I can buy them Lego, which I can play with. More difficult because I'm not quite sure always what I should get the girls. But I try and be fair. One particular Christmas, I bought my nephew one very big present. I bought his sister, my niece, several smaller presents, adding up to the same amount of money. My nephew opened his presents. My niece opened her presents. My nephew looked at my niece's presents and says, "It's not fair." And I said, "What? She's got 4 presents and I've only got 1. And I thought, I just can't win, can I? But then I thought, where did he get that sense of justice from? I mean, he was only 5. Where do we get this sense of right and wrong from? I mean, everybody in the world has it. We don't always agree on what is right and wrong, but we all agree that there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. Now again, if there is a God who made us, an absolute being, then of course it would follow, wouldn't it, that maybe if that God was a moral being, that he would make us in his image to reflect that. But if there is no God, and we just live in a material universe, trying to come to absolute moral values is a very difficult thing to do. As David Hume, the philosopher, says, you can't get an ought from an is. You can't say what ought to happen or ought not to happen simply from observing what is around us. Or let me try and illustrate it this way. Sometimes when I go into schools, I use this illustration and I say, look at this famous sculpture. And I say to them, what do you see? Now, the only problem is, if they're kind of teenage boys, then what they tell me at this point is not necessarily what I'm after, okay? But what do most adults see in this picture? They normally say something like this: a woman without any arms. Now, I say, why do you see that? And the answer, of course, is because you know what a woman normally looks like. And that isn't what a woman normally looks like. You have some standard by which you can judge that picture. And in the same way, when we say something is wrong, or something ought not to be, or something is evil, we assume that there is a standard by which we're judging it. But where do we get that from, if it's not from God? So that's the third piece of evidence that we might look at. You may want to ask questions on those later. But you might say, okay, they're clues that point us towards the possibility that God might exist. But is there anything more conclusive than that? Or is that all we have to go on? And our problem here is that if there actually is a God who isn't just an illusion, how would we know anything more about God? Because if God is God and we are his creation and he is the creator, then it'd be impossible, wouldn't it, for us to really know any more about him? He is infinite and we are finite. Maybe to illustrate it, imagine this. Here's Harry Potter, okay? How would Harry Potter ever discover J.K. Rowling? Okay? And the answer is he can't, right? Because she is the author of the story in which he is a character. Okay? He could never discover her because he's in the story and she's outside the story. But imagine for a moment that J.K. Rowling decides she's going to write another Harry Potter book. Some of you are very excited at this point. And she's going to write another Harry Potter book. And the new head teacher of Hogwarts School is herself. She writes herself into the story. Now, if she did that, then of course Harry could discover who she is because now she's stepped into the story. Now, of course, that's just an illustration, but it illustrates the profound claim that's at the heart of the Christian faith, and it's this: that God, who created this universe, has stepped into the universe. As it were, he has written himself into the story of human history. And the Christian claim is this: that he did it in the person of Jesus. You see, we can argue about the origins of the universe forever. But of course, the difficulty is none of us were there. But actually, the Christian claim is, if you want to look at the evidence for God, look at the evidence for Jesus Christ from 2,000 years ago. Because the Christian claim is that in Jesus, God himself stepped into space and time. Now, you may have questions about the historicity of the accounts of that, and you can ask them later. But let me just say, as someone who studied them in great detail, there's good reasons to take them as historically reliable. But you may also say, well, hang on a minute. The idea that Jesus was God is a big problem for me. And I accept that for a lot of people today, it is a big problem. If you're an atheist, obviously it would be a problem because you don't believe in God, and of course, God can't therefore be a human being. If you were a Muslim, that would be a big problem because central to the tenets of Islam is the idea that God could not come into this world as a human being. He is separate to it. But I'd also want to say this: the very first people who came to this conviction that Jesus was in fact God probably found it difficult equally as much, but just for different reasons. The first people who came to the conviction that Jesus of Nazareth was God were, on the whole, Jews from the first century. And there were probably a less likely people in all of history to come to that conviction than them. They were absolutely convinced that this was impossible, that God wouldn't become a human being and live amongst them. And yet, they came to that conviction. And the question is, why? Why would they do that? And the answer is that as they encountered Jesus, they encountered someone who did the kind of things that only God could do and said the kind of things that only God could say. And so actually, through Jesus' life, he made all sorts of claims that kind of pointed away from himself, towards himself. He said things like this: I can forgive your sins. A claim that those around him knew was only a claim that God could make, because only God can forgive sins. He claimed to be one with God. He said, if you meet me, you've met God. He claimed to be eternal, to predate Abraham, the father of the Jewish religion who had died 2,000 years before. He claimed to be the judge of the world, despite the fact he had told everyone else that they shouldn't judge. He said that heaven and earth will pass away, but his words will never pass away. On one occasion, he took the name of God from the Old Testament, the I am, Yahweh, and he used it about himself. He said, before Abraham was, I am. And incredibly, he accepted people's worship. So after his resurrection from the dead, there was a guy called Thomas who came and met Jesus. He was a doubter, a skeptic. He didn't think it was true. And Thomas's reaction to Jesus was quite incredible. You see, if you were to come up to me at the end of this meeting tonight and you got down on your hands and knees and said, Michael, my Lord and my God, I might say thank you for the compliments, but I think you've overstated it just a little, okay? But Thomas, meeting Jesus, falls at his knees and says to Jesus, my Lord and my God, and Jesus doesn't rebuke him for saying it, but for taking so long to say it. So again and again, Jesus says things that only God could say. Now, on that alone, it wouldn't mean much, would it? Because, I could do that. I could walk around Oulu tomorrow with a big placard on me saying, I am the way to God. If you've met me, you've met God, and so on. And you would probably think I was crazy, and you would probably be right. So it's one thing to say it, but it's another thing to get people to believe you, right? And so Jesus himself says, don't just believe because of what I say, but also because of what I do. And again, Jesus does the kind of things that only God could do. So he's able to heal the sick. He's able to make the blind see and the lame walk and the deaf hear. He's able to calm a storm and walk on water. He's able to feed thousands with a little boy's packed lunch. He's able to raise the dead, and most incredibly, he's able to come back from death himself. And that massive claim is one we're going to look at and look at the evidence for tomorrow night. But all of that caused these first followers of Jesus to come to that conviction, hey, in Jesus, God himself has stepped into human history. Now, you may want to ask questions about that later, but I think there's good reasons to think that could be true. And if that is true, let me just wrap up with 3 implications, okay, for us. If it's true, number 1, God isn't just an illusion, okay? You might say, well, some people believe in God because they just want it to be true. Now, as we said, we can throw that the other way. But what I want to say is it true? Look at the evidence. And in particular, unpack the evidence for Jesus. And in my experience, not only of talking to those who don't believe in God, but also reading some of the greatest atheists of history, the one thing they often don't do is engage with the evidence, particularly for Jesus. So make sure you check that out. God's not just an illusion. But secondly, if Jesus is God, actually we can get to know what God is like. You know, one of the reasons I find that people don't believe in God is not so much that they, like Thomas Nagel, can't believe in God, but they don't want to. And often the reason why they don't want to is they have an assumption of what God is like. And their assumption is basically God is some kind of divine dictator. You know, like some Hitler in the heavens or a Stalin in the sky who is there like a divine policeman to punish us when we step out of line. And the idea of this cosmic judge just doesn't appeal to us. And that's why looking at Jesus is so important, because it reveals a very different kind of God to the one that I might imagine or create. A God who is incredibly loving. A God whose harshest words are actually to religious, self-righteous hypocrites, and whose strongest welcome is to those whose lives, like we've heard tonight, are broken and need putting right. And a God who didn't say, I'm coming to judge, but a God who said, I'm coming to rescue. So check out Jesus, because he'll show you what God is like, if that is true. And thirdly, I want to say, if this is true, then it tells us that actually God is interested in us. Because God actually stepped into our broken world and got involved in the mess and got his hands dirty so that we could actually know him, so that we could have a relationship with him. And as Mika said earlier, he went not just into this world, but he went ultimately to a cross where he died, taking upon himself all of the rubbish of humanity, all of the rubbish of your life and mine, so that we can have this fresh start. So that we can not just know kind of intellectually that God exists, but we can know experientially in our lives this relationship with him that can transform our lives, just as we've heard explained earlier. So my question to you is, what are you going to make of this? Well, we're going to have a break in a moment for you to ask those questions. And I guess, as I said a moment before, some of you might say, well, this is rubbish. I don't believe it. If that's you, tell us why. You know, throw your questions back and text in a moment. But also, as I said, if you do think that, make sure before you reject this, you really do investigate the evidence for Jesus for yourself. And to maybe help you do that, we've got some books available over there. If you're our guest tonight, if you're not part of the OPCO group, you can have them for free, okay? If you are part of the OPCO group, you can give us some money, okay? It's the only society in the university that is more beneficial not to be part of, okay? So grab one of those books. The one, But Is It True, would probably be helpful for you. It looks at some of these evidences that we've talked about tonight. You might want to think about this more and find out more about this. And if that's you, then we'd love to help you do that. And we'll tell you at the end how you can keep checking this out and find out more. And the group here will be organising more things after this week is finished. Or maybe you're saying, actually, I really would like to know how I can discover this life change for myself, just as you've heard about it explained earlier. Well, again, at the end, I'll tell you about a little booklet I've got. In fact, I'll show you now. It's in here. A booklet called Yes that I'd love to give to you if that's you. And that explains more about how you can get started for yourself. Okay? But we're going to take a break now. You can grab a drink, grab the toilets. But even better, why not turn to the people around you on your tables and discuss what you've heard and say, what did you make of that? What question do you have? What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? And then get someone to start writing those questions down. We'll be back in 5 or 10 minutes to look at a few of those questions. So go for that now. Thank you. But fundamentally, I want to say, why should you decide to follow Jesus if that's what you decide to do? Not primarily because your life will get better or worse, but primarily because it's true. If it's true, it's worth following, whatever the consequences are. And in sense of that, I think there are some good reasons to say it really is objectively true, and therefore it is worth following whatever happens afterwards. Okay?
Thank you. And next question, does each and every one of us have a piece of God and Jesus within us?
Do we all have a kind of piece of God or piece of Jesus within us? I guess it's quite a kind of popular philosophy, isn't it, to say, that God is within each one of us, and we look into ourselves to find God. And it might be a nice idea. The reality is, though, often when I look into myself, I don't always find much that's good. When I spend my time looking inwards, I find actually there's a lot that isn't good. And after a while, trying to convince us that we're basically God and that basically everything's okay kind of comes up against experience, and it doesn't always work, does it? I think the Christian claim is this, that by nature we don't find God within us, we find him in Jesus, so we look outside of ourselves to look at the objective evidence for Jesus. But this is the kind of staggering claim. The claim is that actually in our experience, if we come to know and follow Jesus, that by his Spirit, his unseen self, the Holy Spirit is what the Bible calls him, he does then come on board in our lives in a very real and felt and experienced way. And in that sense, yeah, God does come within and change us, just as we've heard that story from Mika tonight. But actually, that doesn't happen by default. That happens when we actually ask for that to happen, because God doesn't force his way into our lives. He wants a relationship, and a relationship can't be forced, can it? It has to be chosen. Otherwise, it's not a real relationship. In the same way, we need to choose to respond to this offer of God's relationship with us. And if we respond, then he'll come on board. But we've got to make that decision for ourselves.
And Michael, you talked a little bit about this yesterday when there was a question about it, but I think because there are so many people that weren't here yesterday, there is a question about why it is just Christian God? Why not Allah? Why not Krishna?
Why not just the Christian God? Why not other gods? Again, it's an interesting question because particularly in this part of the world at the moment, probably one of the most, and by that I mean kind of the Western world, not Oulu particularly, but in kind of the Western world in the 21st century, a popular philosophy is what is technically called pluralism, or basically the idea that it doesn't matter what religion you follow, they're basically kind of all the same, or equally valid or equally true. And that's a very popular idea, and you understand why, but I want to say, just because it's popular doesn't mean it's true, okay? I want to ask a question like we did tonight. What's the evidence that that is true? Secondly, it's difficult to actually kind of live that out in reality. I find often it's quite dismissive of the specific claims religions make. See, actually, you don't need to have a PhD in comparative religion to realize that religions make very different claims about God. So if you're a Buddhist, you wouldn't really talk about God at all. If you're a Hindu, you might talk about many gods. If you're a Muslim, you'd talk about one God, a singularity, as it were. And if you're a Christian, you would talk about the idea of God being a trinity, one God expressed in three persons. All of them very, very different. And in one sense, not compatible in that way. And so actually saying they're all the same is rather disingenuous to people who hold strong religious convictions. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that we all have to fight about it. And actually tolerance, which I think is a good thing, assumes that we don't all agree. If you have to tolerate people, it assumes that we have differences of opinion. So tolerance is great, but it assumes that we're not all the same and it's not all the same thing. Fundamentally, how do we know what's true? Well, as I said last night, you need to ask the question, is there an objective basis on which these claims are made? And what I think we can say uniquely about the Christian faith is, because it's based on the objective evidence for God stepping into human history in the person of Jesus and his life and death and resurrection, you can weigh up the evidence for that. And if that claim is true, then it is a claim that is above and beyond any other religious or spiritual claim that's ever been made in history. That God has actually come into this world as a human being, lived, died, and rose again. If that's true, I would suggest that your search ends there. If it's not true, then by all means, check everything else out. But maybe start with that first fundamental question, which is why, as I said earlier, tomorrow, particularly for the resurrection, because that is such a foundational claim before everything else.
Thank you. And also there is a question, if Christian God is real, why is there so much suffering in the world?
Yeah, again, we kind of touched on this again last night, but for those who aren't here, I guess that is one of the biggest questions that we could ask. And it's an assumption, isn't it? If there is a God, why all this suffering? Particularly the God of the Bible, you know, a God of love, a God of compassion. Where does that come from? And again, as I said last night, it's impossible for me to try and unpack that in full detail in a 2-minute answer to a question. There is a chapter in one of the books, you could take that away and read that in more detail. I guess what I'd say is this, that actually getting rid of God doesn't get rid of the problem. For a start, obviously, if there's no God, there's still suffering. But also, if there is no God, why do we find suffering such a problem? I mean, if this is just the way the world is, and life is just an accident and we've come from nowhere, we're going to nothing, then where does that kind of ingrained sense of injustice come from? And that's a question we might want to think about. Why is there suffering? I guess one of the answers that Christians have given through history is this, that actually it's linked to our sense of freedom and free will. Let me illustrate. Imagine I meet this girl, I take her out on a few dates. After a few months, I decide that it's time to pop the question. And so we go out on a kind of romantic evening. At the end of the evening, I get down on one knee, and I say to this girl, "You will marry me." Now, I know that's not normally what people say, but that's just changing the order of the words, isn't it? So it's not a big problem, right? And then I say to her, "And when you marry me, I want you to know that on Mondays, you'll cook me steak. On Tuesdays, you'll cook me pizza. On Wednesdays, you'll cook me pasta. On Thursdays, you'll do the washing. On Fridays, you'll do the ironing. If you do it well, you can have a day off on Saturday." Now, if that's my view of marriage, you can understand why at the age of 37, I'm still single. Because that's not how it works, right? For love to be real, there has to be real choice. The ability to say no. God created a world where love is possible. But that means that people had the real choice to reject the love of God and to reject the love of others. He didn't make us robots who simply had to do what he said. He gave us free will because he loved us and he wanted us to be beings of love. The tragedy of history is that people have often used that freedom to reject God, reject others, and to damage our world. The incredible wonder of the Christian story is that in spite of all that, God stepped into this suffering world, suffered himself in the person of Jesus, and through that suffering has made it possible that one day this broken world could be put right. Now that's a very shortened down answer to a very big question that probably hasn't really tapped into some of the specific questions we might have. And can I just say, if you've got questions that you'd rather ask personally, please do talk to me at the end or grab me tomorrow at the university. I'll be around and you can come and talk more, okay?
And actually, there is a bit more detailed question about it. How did evil come to the world?
How did evil come into the world? one of the answers that the Bible seems to give is that behind evil in the world as a kind of thing, there is someone. Now, the moment Christians start talking about kind of Satan and demonic forces and the spiritual realm, we're kind of thinking, whoa, we've got in deep, okay? And again, that probably raises loads of questions that we probably want to ask and sit down and discuss. Although actually, it's hard to deny that there is something wrong with our broken world, so it may be worth thinking about where that comes from, right? And what the Bible says is that ultimately, that may be the case that not only has there been something that's gone wrong amongst humanity, but something that's gone wrong in the very spiritual dimension of our world too. Now, the Bible probably doesn't say as much as we'd like to know about that and how that happened and when that happened and all the details around that. But what it does say is that although something has gone wrong, that number one, God is not the source of that. God is not the source of evil. But number two, there is hope that one day God is going to sort that out, that evil itself is going to be a thing of history. And the evidence for that is the resurrection.
And if we were created by an absolute being and given our understanding of fairness and morality by God, how do we disagree on right or wrong?
Okay, so if we're created by this absolute being, why don't we all agree on what is right and wrong? That's a really good question. And I think partly it comes down to the fact that, again, we are given free will. I think you might say that God has written his morality in two ways, or maybe three, we could say. And firstly, he's written his morality or standards into a book. And initially, he gave that to the Jewish people. And then, of course, that extends as Christians throughout what we call now the whole Bible. And so we see something of what God is for and what God is against through that book. Secondly, we can see something of what is right and wrong through our conscience. And so actually, even if you've never read the Bible, you can kind of get something of that just through being a human being. And that's why actually, to a large degree, almost all of humanity does agree on certain things being right and wrong. Okay? There's a great unanimity. That's the incredible thing. But our conscience alone is not always the best guide of what is right and wrong. Because I like to think that our conscience is a little bit like an alarm clock. An alarm clock is there to alert you to something. But the problem is, the more you ignore it, the less you hear it, right? And that's why normally when I have to get up early, I have to set about 6 alarms. Because I just kind of get into default habit of turning them off. And our conscience is like that. So ignore it enough, and actually things that initially we would have had a problem with, we don't have a problem with anymore. So we have to be careful that our feelings are not the ultimate gauge. And I would say, therefore, the ultimate expression of goodness that we see is not just in a book or in our feelings, but in a person. And so actually the Christian claim is that Jesus lives out or embodies what it really looks like to be truly human. And rather than just giving us a list of laws, he exemplifies that. Which is why actually there is something about Jesus which is both wonderful but also kind of scary. Because he's like this kind of spotlight. And in the light of Jesus, the darkness of our lives kind of gets shown up. Because we realize in comparison to him how far fall we short. That's also why it's really good that Jesus didn't just come to be a moral example. If that was all, that would be really bad news. He came to be more than that. He came to be someone who rescued us from that bad stuff and that darkness through his death and resurrection.
Thank you. And lastly, there is some advice for you to give. How can I really find God and be in contact with him?
Great. Well, I'm glad it was advice on that. I thought when you said some advice to give, it was going to be on marriage or something like that. And I was going to say, please don't ask me. No, thank you. Yeah, ask someone with some experience. How can I make contact with God? That's a really good question, because maybe you're here tonight and you've heard about this. You know, I've given a talk, you've heard Mika share something of his story, and you're saying, well, how does that happen for me? How do I experience that? And as I've said already, the basic center of the Christian faith is the concept of being able to have a relationship with God. And if you think about it, a relationship takes buy-in from both sides, doesn't it? We have an expression in English, it takes 2 to tango, right? You can't just do it on your own. And a relationship needs to be freely chosen by both sides. And I think it's the same with God. Imagine, actually, a marriage, if you will. I am not married, but I have married several people to other people, if you get my drift, as the minister. And you know what it's like when you're in a kind of wedding situation, and like I'm the minister standing at the front, dressed a bit more smartly than I am tonight. And then you've got the groom standing there. You know, he's looking all right as well. He's had a shower at least. And then in walks the bride, and she's looking kind of stunning. And she walks down and everyone's looking at her, and she comes to the front and she faces the groom and he faces her, and everyone's like, wow. And then basically the minister, the guy at the front, he asks some questions, doesn't he? He says to the guy, firstly, do you take this girl to be your wife? And he says, I do. And then he turns to the woman and says, do you take this guy to be your husband? And for some reason she says, I do. And then they say a few other words, they kiss, and they sign some stuff, and that's kind of it, right? They're married, okay? But basically, it's a commitment from both sides. And the same is true with God. Imagine it's a bit like this. It's a bit like there's Jesus, and there's you and me. And then there's God. And God says to Jesus, Jesus, will you take this person with all of their wrong and with all their mistakes and all the stuff that they've done, and Jesus, knowing all of that about them, will you love them and accept them throughout life and throughout death and into eternity? And Jesus says yes. In fact, he holds out his arms on a cross and he says yes. That's how much he loves us. And then God just says to us, okay, will you take this Jesus? So God has made his commitment to us. The question is, have we made a commitment to him? It's got to be a choice. If it's not a choice, it's not love. It's not a relationship. And so I'd say, how do you make that choice? Well, maybe 3 words are really good words to say in this regard. And they're some of the most simple words you learn when you're a child. The word sorry, the word thank you, the word please. To say to this God, firstly, sorry. I know that I've screwed up. I know that everything isn't right in my life. I know that I need you to forgive me. I'm sorry. And then the second word, thank you, to say to Jesus, thank you that actually you were willing to take all of that stuff so that I don't have to. You were willing to pay so that I don't have to pay. You love me enough to die for me. And then thirdly, the word please. Please will you come into my life and forgive me and give me this relationship with you. And if we are willing to say that, then actually God says, I'm willing to take you. And you can start that relationship. And you can start it tonight. You could do that right here. You could do it when you get home. You could ask God to do that for you. It'd be the best decision you'd ever make. It'd be the beginning of a relationship that I guarantee will change your life dramatically. And as I said earlier, it won't always be easy, but it will always be worth it.